Hello and welcome to True Crime on the History Fella channel. In today's case we're looking at the acid bath murders. John George Haigh was born on the 24th of July 1909 in Stamford, Lincolnshire. His parents were John, an engineer, and his mother Emily. The family moved to Outwood, which was in West Riding in Yorkshire. When John was younger, they were active members of the local Protestant church, the Plymouth Brethren. Now the young Haigh was a fan of classical music and played the piano. He was a good student who won scholarships to Queen Elizabeth Grammar School and Wakefield Cathedral, where he became a choir boy. Haigh, though, had an odd sense of humour, and he was bullied at school. He'd pull a stool out from under the elderly organist when she sat down to play, and he also chased a pig around its sty until it died from exhaustion. For this, Haigh was beaten. When he finished school, Haigh worked as an apprentice engineer at a firm. He was, though, subsequently fired for adding sugar to the boss's petrol tank. But he held other jobs in insurance and advertising, but once again was fired after he was accused of stealing from the petty cash box. In 1934, Haigh married Betty Hamer. However, the marriage didn't last long, as he was arrested 4 months later for car fraud and was sentenced to 15 months in prison. Whilst he was incarcerated, Betty gave birth to a daughter who was given up for adoption when Betty divorced Haigh. In 1936, Haigh was released from prison and moved down to London, where he became a chauffeur to an arcade owner called William McSwan, who would later become his first victim. He left his employment at McSwan and invented a new persona, William Cato Adamson. Adamson was a solicitor with multiple offices, including in London and Guildford, Surrey, where he sold fraudulent stocks and shares to unsuspecting victims. This scam ended when someone noticed his fictitious surname was misspelt on his letterhead. He was handed a 4-year prison sentence for fraud, but subsequently spent time in and out of prison for the next several years. During his last stretch in prison, Haigh realised he kept getting caught because his victims were able to alert authorities. From here, Haigh learned about French murderer George Alexandre Serret, who disposed of his victims' bodies by using sulfuric acid. Keen to try out the method, Haigh began to experiment in his cell with acid and field mice. In 1943, Haigh was released from prison, and it was now time to start his new murderous trail. Haigh had a chance meeting with McSwan once he was released from prison at a pub in Kensington. McSwan was now working for his parents, Donald and Amy, collecting rent from their London properties. On the 6th of September 1944, McSwan disappeared. Haigh later confessed to enticing McSwan into the basement of 79 Gloucester Road and bludgeoning him to death. His motive was jealousy, and he wanted McSwan's lifestyle. He placed his body into an industrial barrel and poured concentrated sulfuric acid onto him. 2 days later, Haigh had returned to find the remaining contents of the barrel could be poured down the drain. Haigh had told William's parents that he'd gone into hiding in Scotland to avoid being drafted into military service. Haigh then took over his collection duties, but in reality he wanted to keep the money for himself. The parents, though, became curious as their son hadn't returned from Scotland and the war was now beginning to near its end. Haigh told them he was back for a visit, and on the 2nd of July 1945, he lured Donald and Amy to the house on Gloucester Road, with the expectation of seeing their son. Haigh once again bludgeoned them to death in the basement and disposed of them in the same way their son had been. Haigh took his 3 victims' possessions, including their pensions and properties, totaling £8,000, which was around £250,000 in today's money, and moved into Onslow Court Hotel. By 1947, Haigh was starting to run out of money again due to excessive gambling. To replenish his fund, Haigh needed a new victim. He had begun to rent a small workshop in Crawley in Sussex, around an hour from London, and bought the old acid barrels down from Kensington. Haigh met a couple when he was viewing their flat, a Dr. Henderson and his young wife Rose. Pretending to be interested in purchasing it from them, Rose found out that Haigh played the piano and asked him to play at the housewarming party at their new property. Whilst at the party, though, Haigh stole the doctor's gun. Haigh invited Dr. Henderson to the workshop in Crawley to show him an invention he'd been working on. Instead, Haigh shot the doctor in the head with the gun he'd stolen from him previously. He then contacted Rose Henderson to tell her husband had fallen ill and she needed to come to Crawley. He also shot her in the head on her arrival and disposed of the bodies in the barrels once again. He then forged a letter in the doctor's name to ensure he was given control of their assets, and sold all the possessions amounting to £8,000. He kept their car and their dog. By 1949, Haigh was still living in Onslow Court Hotel and was calling himself an engineer. However, he was running out of money again, so he sought out his final victim. Olive, 69, was a wealthy widow who also lived at Onslow Court Hotel. She knew Haigh was supposedly an engineer, so she told him about her idea for false fingernails. Haigh took the opportunity to invite Olive to the workshop in Crawley. On the 18th of February 1949, Olive travelled the hour journey with him to the workshop, where he ended up shooting her in the neck with Dr. Henderson's revolver. He removed her jewellery and expensive black Persian fur coat she was wearing and put her into the acid bath. Olive's friend Constance Lane reported her missing 2 days later. Sergeant Lambourne spoke to John Haigh, who told her that he saw Olive before she left the hotel that day, and that she was wearing her statement black Persian fur coat. Lambourne found it odd, though. Haigh lived in a hotel with occupants, where they were mainly older people. She had an uneasy feeling about Haigh and thought he may be involved. A description was sent out to all police divisions by Inspector Sims, but by that evening he had started looking into Haigh due to Lambourne's comments. Sims and Detective Inspector Webb went back to Onslow to question the hotel manager, Miss Robbie. She told him that she'd never seen any visitors with Haigh, and that he wore expensive clothes and drove flashy cars. He was also late paying for his room recently, which he had eventually settled up 2 days before Olive went missing. Sims and Webb went upstairs to speak to Haigh in his room, where he invited them in. He recalled the same statement he'd told Lambourne earlier in that day. He added that Olive was carrying a red bag when she left the lobby. What Haigh didn't realise, though, was Inspector Sims already knew him. He'd questioned Haigh years earlier and knew he was a con man. Back at the station, Sims ordered a record search on John George Haigh from Scotland Yard. The search came back with all of Haig's convictions, and it detailed his history with crime. However, a white-collar crime like fraud didn't usually amount to murder, so he wasn't initially convinced that Haigh had killed Olive. By the following day, Olive's image was in newspapers and distributed to taxi drivers, but no one had seen her since her departure from the hotel. Finally, another occupant of the Onslow Court Hotel came forward to tell police that she had seen Olive in the hotel's lobby that morning. Olive had told the witness that she was driving to Crawley with Mr. Haigh. He had been the only witness to see her alleged solo departure from the hotel that day. Sims set about getting inside of Crawley's workshop, or inside the workshop in Crawley. The inside of the workshop was sparse with a few boxes, tools, and empty bottles of sulfuric acid littering the sideboards. The windows were painted over and little light entered the building. The only item that looked out of place was a locked leather hat box, which was taken into evidence. Sims received the report on the contents of the hat box once it had been forced open. It contained the revolver belonging to Dr. Henderson, 8 rounds of ammunition in an envelope, heavy red cellophane paper, and a receipt from a dry cleaning shop near Crawley for a black Persian fur coat. Officers canvassed the area and surrounding towns. A bookkeeper at the George Hotel in Crawley instantly recognised Olive and recalled the black fur coat and the red bag she was carrying. She also knew Haigh as the man who drove Olive to the hotel to use the restroom in the nearby town of Horsham. A shop had bought jewellery that had matched Olive's, and the jeweller identified Haigh as the man who sold him the pieces. Haigh was kept at the station while Sims and Superintendents Barrett and Mahone drove to the hotel to search Haigh's room. They returned hours later to the station with several items in their possession. Their search brought back a shirt covered in bloodstains and a penknife with blood on it. They also recovered a shopping list written by Haigh that included items which could be used for disposing of another body, including bottles of acid, rubber gloves, cellophane, and cotton wadding. They also had the jewellery and the black fur coat with them. Haigh confessed to killing Olive, the McSwans, and the Hendersons, and 3 others. However, he couldn't be proved. He told police that drinking the blood of his victims was driving him insane, but there was no proof he ever did this either. However, Haigh hadn't considered what had been left behind, and forensics soon realised that the brown sludge behind the workshop were human remains. On closer inspection, pathologist Keith Simpson found 28 pounds of body fat, part of a foot, gallstones, and part of a denture identified as Olive's by her dentist. The Daily Mirror went with the headline Vampire Horror in London, SW7, for the front page of their newspaper on Thursday the 3rd of March 1949. The constant vilifying of Haigh saw the editor, Sylvester Bolam, stand before a court and be sentenced to 3 months in prison with a £10,000 fine. In early August 1949, Haigh finally went to trial at Sussex Assizes in Lewes. He couldn't afford his own defence, so the News of the World newspaper offered to pay for his solicitor if he gave them an exclusive story. However, the jury took just 6 minutes to deliberate his fate and found him sane and guilty of murdering 6 people, and he wouldn't be allowed to appeal his sentencing. When being transferred to Wandsworth Prison, Haigh asked one of the prison guards if it would be possible to have a trial run of his hanging to iron out any issues. In prison, his physician, Dr. Yellowless, noticed his childhood nightmares, which Haigh claimed lured him into becoming a bloodlusting murderer. In quotes, "I saw a forest of crucifixes which gradually turned into trees. At first I see dew or rain running from the branches, but when I came nearer I knew it was blood. All of a sudden the whole forest began to twist about trees and streamed with blood. Blood ran from the trunks, blood ran from the branches, all red and shiny. I felt weak and seemed to faint. I saw a man going round the trees gathering blood. When the cup that he was holding in his hand was full, he came up to me and said, 'Drink.' But I was paralyzed. The dream vanished, but I still felt faint and stretched out with all my strength towards the cup." He told Dr. Yellowless that his vision is what led him to his vicious path, but his revelation of insanity didn't help his sentencing. On Wednesday the 10th of August 1949, John George Haigh, the acid bath murderer, was hanged at Wandsworth Prison before a crowd of 500 people. The News of the World got their exclusive, and he donated one of his favourite suits to Madame Tussauds for his waxwork. John George Haigh's motives were never clear, despite his insanity pleas. Some believe he thought he was a vampire who enjoyed drinking blood. Others thought he was just a cold-hearted killer who believed he could get away with murder if the body was never found. If Haigh had been more meticulous, he might well have continued to get away, unhindered with his crimes. And there we have the case of the acid bath murderers. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please give it a thumbs up. And please make sure you're subscribed. And we'll see you very soon for more true crime.